The neighborhood of Frankford in Philadelphia felt solid. It was a place of brick row homes, corner stores, and local bars. People knew each other. Families stayed for generations. It was a working class part of the city, built on industry and routine. You worked your shift, came home, and knew what to expect. Life wasn't always easy, but it was predictable. And that predictability was a kind of comfort, but in the late 1980s, that comfort started to crack. A fear, cold and sharp, began to creep through the familiar streets. It started quietly, a single tragedy that felt like an aberration. Then it happened again. And again. A shadow had fallen over Frankfurt, and it was hunting the most vulnerable people in the community. Someone was killing women. The newspapers gave him a name that stuck, a name that still sends a chill through people who remember that time. They called him the Frankford Slasher. The horror began on a hot August day in 1985. Helen Patton was 89 years old. She lived alone in a small apartment. She was a neighborhood fixture, someone people would see on her daily walks. When a neighbor noticed her mail piling up, they got worried. Police were called to do a wellness check. They forced their way into her apartment and found her. She had been stabbed to death. The scene was brutal, and it made no sense. Robbery didn't seem to be the motive. Nothing of value was gone. It was just a vicious, senseless act of violence against a frail, elderly woman. The police investigated, but they had little to go on. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry. It was a baffling crime, but at the time it was seen as an isolated one. A terrible, tragic event, but a single event nonetheless. The neighborhood mourned, people were a little more careful about locking their doors, and life went on. The case went cold. A year and a half passed. The memory of Helen Patton's murder faded into the background noise of the city. Then, in January 1987, it happened again. Anna Carroll, 75 years old, was found dead in her apartment. The circumstances were terrifyingly similar. She lived alone. There was no forced entry, and she had been stabbed multiple times. The police looked at the case file for Helen Patton, and the similarities were too strong to ignore. The fear started to return. This wasn't a random act. It was a pattern. A task force was formed. Detectives started to work the streets, knocking on doors, talking to everyone they could. But Frankfurt was a neighborhood where people kept to themselves. They were wary of outsiders and they were wary of the police. And more than anything, they were scared. The killer seemed to be a ghost. He could get into locked apartments without breaking a window or jimmying a door. He moved silently, chose his victims carefully, and left behind almost no clues. The killer didn't wait long this time. A few months later, in April, another woman was found. Susan Olzef was 64. She was discovered in her apartment, the victim of a frenzied knife attack. This time, there was an even more disturbing element. The killer had sexually assaulted her after she was dead. This detail was kept from the public, but for the investigators, it painted a sickening picture of the person they were hunting. This wasn't about robbery, it wasn't about anger, it was about power and a depraved kind of cruelty. Frankfurt was now a neighborhood under siege. The fear was a living thing. Women, especially older women living alone, were terrified. They stopped going out after dark, they bought new locks, chains, and deadbolts for their doors. People bought dogs for protection. The simple act of walking to the corner store became a source of anxiety. Every strange man was a potential suspect. Every noise in the night was the sound of the slasher at the door. The sense of community, once a source of strength, began to fray. Trust eroded. The neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The police were under immense pressure. The media was all over the story. The public demanded answers, but the detectives had nothing. The killer was methodical. He left no fingerprints. DNA testing was in its infancy, and not the powerful tool it is today. The investigation was old-fashioned police work. It was about hitting the pavement, following hunches, and trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of a city. And the killings continued. Jana Durkin, 68, was murdered in her home in August 1987. Then Margaret Vaughn, 66, in January 1988. Carol Dowd, 46, was found in her apartment in October 1988. Each crime scene was a new nightmare, a fresh confirmation of the monster walking their streets. The victim profile was consistent women, often living alone, vulnerable. The method was always the same, a brutal stabbing. The task force, led by a determined detective named Joseph Stein, worked around the clock. They chased down hundreds of leads, they interviewed known criminals and mentally ill individuals in the area. They created a profile of the killer. He was likely a white male, probably lived in or near Frankfurt, and knew the area intimately. He was able to gain his victims' trust or talk his way into their homes. He was a blitz-style attacker, overwhelming his victims with sudden, shocking violence. But a profile is just a theory. It doesn't give you a name or a face. The breakthrough came from the murder of Carol Dowd. She was younger than the other victims, which was a slight deviation, but the method was the same. And this time, there was something new. A witness. A woman in the apartment building saw a man leaving Dowd's apartment around the time of the murder. She didn't think much of it at the time, but when the body was discovered, she went to the police. She gave them a description. A white man, medium build, with a distinctive face. The police brought in a sketch artist. The witness sat for hours trying to recall every detail. The result was a composite sketch. It wasn't a photograph, but it was a face. It was the first real lead the police had in years. They printed thousands of copies of the sketch and plastered them all over Frankfurt. They were on telephone poles, in store windows, and on the front page of the newspaper. "Have you seen this man?" the posters asked. The whole city was looking at that face, hoping someone would recognize the ghost who had haunted them for so long. The sketch generated a flood of tips. The police switchboard was overwhelmed. Their detectives chased down every call, but each one led to a dead end. Days turned into weeks. The hope that the sketch had generated began to fade. Maybe it was just another false lead. And maybe the witness was mistaken. Maybe the slasher would never be caught. Then came the one call that changed everything. It wasn't from a stranger, it came from a woman who lived in the area. She had seen the sketch in the paper. She looked at it and a feeling of dread washed over her. She recognized the man. It was her brother-in-law. His name was Leonard Christopher. She was hesitant to call. It seemed impossible. Leonard was a quiet guy. He worked at a fish market. He had a wife and kids. He was a normal, everyday person. He wasn't a monster, but she couldn't shake the resemblance. The eyes, the set of his jaw. It was him. After wrestling with her conscience, she picked up the phone and called the police. Detectives Joseph Stein and his team were cautious. They had been down this road before. But this tip felt different. It came from family. They looked into Leonard Christopher's background. He was 36 years old. He lived in the Frankfurt area. He had a minor criminal record, but nothing that would suggest he was a serial killer. On the surface, he was just another guy trying to get by. The detectives decided to bring him in for questioning. They didn't storm his house with sirens blaring. They approached him quietly. On January 18th, 1991, years after the first murder, they found him at his job at the fish market. They asked him to come down to the station to talk. They said they were investigating some burglaries in the neighborhood. Leonard Christopher agreed to go. He seemed calm, cooperative. They sat him down in a small bare interrogation room at the police headquarters known as the Roundhouse. For hours, they talked to him. They asked him about his life, his work, where he was on certain dates. Christopher was cool. He denied everything. He was just a working man. He didn't know anything about any murders. But the detectives were skilled. They didn't yell or threaten. They just kept talking. They built a rapport. They were patient. They watched his body language, the way his eyes flickered when they mentioned a certain street or a victim's name. The hours ticked by. It was a battle of wills. Then they showed him the composite sketch. They told him a witness had seen him leaving Carol Dowd's apartment. They saw a change in him. A flicker of fear. A crack in the calm facade. The denial started to get weak. He started to contradict himself. The detectives pushed. They told him they knew what he did. They told him it was time to tell the truth. They told him they wanted to understand why. And then, after nearly 14 hours of relentless, patient questioning, Leonard Christopher broke. The confession started as a trickle and then became a flood. He began to talk. He told them everything. He started with Carol Dowd. He said he had gone to her apartment to use the phone. He claimed she made a comment that angered him, and he just snapped. He pulled out a knife and stabbed her. It was the opening the detectives needed. Once he admitted to one, the others followed. They went down the list of victims, one by one. Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susan Olseth, Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn. He remembered them all. He described their apartments. He gave the detectives details about the crime scenes that had never been released to the public. Their details only the killer would know. He told them how he killed them, what he did to them afterward. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice. He showed no remorse. It was as if he was describing scenes from a movie he had watched, not a reign of terror he had inflicted. He explained how he got into their homes. Sometimes he would knock and ask to use the phone or for a glass of water. These were older women, from a generation that was more trusting. They would let him in. Other times, he would just find an unlocked door or window. He was an opportunist. He stalked his own neighborhood, looking for easy targets. He confessed to 6 of the murders. He denied involvement in 3 others that had been linked to the slasher case. The police were convinced he was responsible for them all, but they had ironclad confessions for 6. It was enough. The ghost had a name and a face. The hunt for the Frankford Slasher was over. The news of Leonard Christopher's arrest sent a wave of shock and relief through Frankfurt. People were relieved that the killer was finally caught, but they were also shocked that it was him. He wasn't a shadowy figure or a menacing drifter. He was a neighbor. He was the man you might see at the grocery store or pass on the street. The evil that had terrified them for so long had been living right beside them. It was a deeply unsettling realization. The monster was one of them. Leonard Christopher went to trial. His confession was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. His defense lawyers tried to argue that the confession was coerced, that the police had worn him down and forced him to admit to things he didn't do. But the details in the confession were too specific, too accurate. The jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 6 consecutive life sentences. There would be no chance of parole. Leonard Christopher would spend the rest of his life in prison, and he would die there. At his sentencing, he said nothing. He showed no emotion. He offered no apology to the families of the women he had murdered. But even with Christopher behind bars, questions remained. The biggest question was why? Why did he do it? What turned a seemingly ordinary man into a sadistic serial killer? Christopher never gave a clear answer. He talked about blackouts and moments of uncontrollable rage. He sometimes blamed his victims, saying they provoked him. But psychologists and investigators saw something else. They saw a man filled with a deep-seated hatred of women, a man who got a thrill from exerting the ultimate power over the weak and vulnerable. There was no grand motive. It was just a cold, empty void of cruelty. The case of the Frankford Slasher left a permanent scar on the neighborhood. The sense of trust and safety that had been shattered took a long time to heal. For years afterward, people were still more cautious, less trusting. The lock stayed on the doors. The memory of that time of fear was passed down. The name Leonard Christopher became a boogeyman, a real-life monster in the city's history. The story is a stark reminder of a different era of crime solving. Before DNA databases and widespread surveillance cameras, catching a killer like Christopher was incredibly difficult. It relied on witness memory, on community tips, and on the relentless, grinding work of detectives who refused to give up. It was a hunt that took years, cost millions of dollars, and consumed the lives of the investigators. In the end, it wasn't a piece of high-tech evidence that caught the Frankford Slasher. It was a composite sketch and a brave family member who did the right thing. It was a human solution to a human evil. The terror that Leonard Christopher brought to the streets of Frankfurt eventually ended. But for the families of his victims and for the neighborhood that lived through those dark years, the memory of the slasher never really went away. It became a part of the city's story, a chilling chapter about the time a monster walked among them, hidden in plain sight.